While talking about slavery in the British Empire, Australia is often left out of the conversation. Britain officially abolished slavery in 1833, yet several systems of forced and exploitative labor continued across the Australian colonies for decades. Some came through convict transportations, others through the exploitation of Indigenous Australians, and others through the kidnapping and trafficking of Pacific Islanders. Together, these systems helped build colonial Australia. Between the late 1700s and mid 1800s, Britain transported more than 162,000 convicts to Australia. Most came from poor backgrounds in Britain and Ireland. Some were hardened criminals, but many were imprisoned for theft, poverty-related crimes, political dissent, or simple survival. Once transported, convicts lost their freedom completely. They were forced into labor gangs, assigned to settlers, or made to work on roads, farms, ports, and government projects. Huge parts of early Australia were literally built by convict labor. On paper, this was criminal punishment. In practice, conditions often looked very close to slavery. Convicts were chained together in gangs, whipped for disobedience, isolated in brutal penal colonies, and leased out to wealthy landowners who treated them as disposal labor. Women convicts were commonly assigned as domestic servants, where many faced escort abuse and exploitation. Some eventually gained freedom after serving their sentence, others died before even leaving the system. The convict colonies created the physical foundations of modern Australia, but they were built through forced labor, violence, and social control. For Indigenous Australians, colonization brought another form of unfreedom. As settlers expanded across the continent, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples were pushed off their land and forced into exploitative labor systems on cattle stations, missions, pearling industries, and colonial households. Colonial governments often described these policies as protection. In reality, many indigenous people were heavily controlled by the state. Under various Aboriginal Protection Acts, Indigenous Australians could have their movement restricted, their wages controlled, and their children removed from families. In places like Queensland, officials held Indigenous wages in government accounts that workers could barely access. These became known later as the stolen wages. Many Aboriginal workers labored for little or no pay at all. On cattle stations, Indigenous stockmen and domestic workers kept entire rural economies running while living under conditions of poverty, surveillance, and dependency. Children were frequently separated from families, contributing to the trauma later known as the stolen generations. Some historians describe this system as economic slavery because indigenous workers produce wealth while being denied land, freedom, wages, and legal equality. Indigenous communities fought frontier wars against settlers across the continent. Others resisted by escaping missions, preserving culture in secret, or refusing colonial control despite overwhelming violence. As sugar plantations expanded in Queensland and nearby Pacific colonies, plantation owners demanded cheap labor. Recruiters turned toward the islanders of Melanesia and the Pacific. What followed became known as blackbirding. Thousands of Pacific Islanders, especially from the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and nearby regions, were recruited through deception, coercion, or outright kidnapping. Some were promised jobs and safe return home. Others were simply taken by force. More than 60,000 Icelanders were eventually brought to Queensland. Many arrived on plantations where conditions were harsh and tightly controlled. Workers cut sugar cane, cleared land, and built infrastructure under overseers who often used violence and intimidation. Contracts were poorly enforced, wages were low, and movement was restricted. Disease, isolation, and abuse were common. Some laborers were sold between plantations almost like property. Most recruits were men, though families later formed within these communities. Over time, descendants of these workers became part of Australian society and are now known as Australian South Sea Islanders. Resistance occurred through escape attempts, strikes, refusal to work, and occasional uprisings. Missionaries and journalists eventually exposed many of the abuses, increasing public pressure against the trade. After the creation of the Australian Federation in 1901, and the rise of the White Australia policy, Pacific labor migration was restricted and many islanders were deported. Hawaiian Kingdom slavery. Before Western colonization transformed Hawaii, traditional Hawaiian society already had a strict social hierarchy. At the top stood the alii, the ruling chiefs. Below them were commoners. At the very bottom existed a group known as the Koa, people treated as hereditary outcasts and servants. The Koa system functioned in many ways like slavery. Koa families were born into permanent low status. They were tied to chiefs and noble households, denied equal rights, and heavily restricted in marriage and social mobility. Intermarriage between chiefs and Koa was considered taboo. Unlike Atlantic slavery, Hawaii did not develop giant slave markets or plantation systems before European arrival. But the Koa still lived under inherited social bondage that could last for generations. They worked fields, built temples, carried supplies, crafted goods, and served elite households. Some were also used in religious ceremonies connected to the old kapu systems, where spiritual hierarchy and political power were deeply linked. In certain traditions, Koa could even become ritual sacrifices, showing how dehumanized their status could become within the religious structure of the islands. Women performed domestic labor, cloth making, and service work. Men handled farming, fishing, transport, and construction. The system was deeply hereditary. Children born to Koa parents usually inherited the same status, trapping families inside social exclusion across generations. There are few records of organized resistance because Hawaiian society integrated the system into everyday life long before written documentation expanded. But the arrival of missionaries and foreign influence in the early 1800s slowly began changing Hawaiian law and social structures. In 1819, King Kamehameha II abolished the old kapu religious system, weakening many of the traditions tied to hereditary servitude. Over time, the Koa status faded, and later Hawaiian constitution formally banned slavery. But Hawaii soon entered another era of labor exploitation. Under plantation capitalism, where imported workers from Asia faced harsh conditions under colonial economic systems. The history of Koa is often overshadowed by later narratives about the Hawaiian kingdom and American annexation. Yet it remains an important reminder that systems of inherited human bondage existed in many societies long before modern colonialism arrived.